Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Testing in Bahrain is done and dusted. All of the takeaways are set in stone for another year, but the major change spotted today was a reconfiguration of Mercedes front suspension in search of greater performance. It seemed to pay dividends for George Russell as the day progressed, but one thing is very clear indeed, that Red Bull and Max Verstappen are still undisputedly the target in Formula 1 right now. Very much enjoyed to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. Thanks very much also for 40,000 subscribers. Smashing that milestone yesterday. Really appreciate the support lately. Let's keep on cooking because there's going to be lots happening over the coming days. I'm sure about that one. Of course, the season starts next weekend. This time next week, actually on the Thursday, is qualifying for Bahrain Grand Prix because it's a Saturday race this time, as is Jeddah, rather than the usual Sunday. Lewis Hamilton as well, commenting for the first time really publicly in a press conference on the Ferrari move, saying that Fred Vasseur, of course, they have history together back in the GP2 days, was pivotal to this move getting done, and even said that he saw when he signed the deal his future with Mercedes, but then new opportunities opened up at the turn of the year, and I decided to take advantage of them. It was the hardest decision of my life, proud of what I've achieved, but now it's time to write a new chapter effectively on my own. And based on the evidence this weekend's, the Ferrari, and therefore you can also look at next year's car, which is basically the same as this year's car, looks stronger than the Mercedes for now, but we'll see what happens next weekend. And we'll look at all the data today as well, because the long run pace is, again, very interesting indeed. Even Charles Leclerc was very positive about the Ferrari, saying that, look, we've got to wait till next weekend's, but last year's SF23 test, which was a race winner, to be fair, in the hands of Carlos Sainz, but just about, and he was pretty good in Leclerc's hands towards the end of the year, he said last year was the worst test he's ever done. So there's a lot of positivity around Ferrari. The issue is that nobody seems close to Red Bull right now, and as I say, we'll have a look at the data on the long run pace in a second, but even Fernando Alonso today basically said that Aston are not going to be as good as they were last year, and maybe saying to Toto in some way like, hey look, how about we get this deal done for me to go to Mercedes, because that's one of the rumours going around the paddock. He also chucks a dagger, I would say, at Sergio Perez. I think it's quite clear to everyone that Max is the massive favourite for this year's championship, but even Alonso says, I think 19 drivers in the paddock now know they will not win the championship. So he could have said 18 drivers and said, well, if you don't have a Red Bull, you're not going to win, but he said 19, basically saying that Perez knows that he's got no chance against Max, which is true, but, you know, he didn't have to say it, did he? Speaking of Perez, by the way, he did again run over a drain cover, and it's the same corner as before, and maybe you can say, oh, the driver shouldn't run this wide, but, like, that is the optimal racing line. Open up the corner as much as you possibly can, and these type of things happen. I don't know why they can't just, you know, bolt them down, or I think they're going to concrete them in possibly next weekend to avoid this happening again. But there was some discussion about it actually from Newey, who basically said that this is a recurring issue because the cars are so big and so heavy. He actually said too big and too heavy. That's why this keeps happening. So hopefully for 2026, those regulations, they will be smaller and lighter. They will be slightly based on what we've heard, but probably not massively, unfortunately. And even Newey himself, after this incident, was having a look under the floor of the car to check out whether there was any damage to it. This is a pretty funny shot as well that Albert from Braga pointed out that I think I probably ended up chucking on the thumbnail. I think Amanda Newey as well, his wife, came out and said, like, that's what he looks like when he wakes up in the morning. So I thought it was pretty funny really that Newey was underneath his own, you know, rocket ship car, just checking out if there was any damage, and it seemed to be okay. Few eventful moments on track, to be fair. Hamilton had a bit of an incident with, I'm pretty sure, yeah, it was Perez, when he was on a fast lap and Perez got in the way. I will say the Alpine as well, they have made some tweaks to their front wing. They've actually put a bit more colour on it. Looks so much better. It's still an ugly car, I personally think, but this is definitely a step in the right direction. I also think the sponsors will probably be happier because you can actually see the sponsors when it's blue. The black on white, I don't really think it works that well. McLaren again had not a great day. Piastri put in some good laps towards the end. We'll have a look at some of those numbers in a second. But there is an argument that says when you're using this much flow-vis on the car, whether it's really good or bad, because usually when they use flow-vis, they will, you know, look at a certain element, one half of the front wing, the rear wing, or, you know, the side pod inlet, whatever the case might be. But on this case, there is quite clearly quite a lot going on here. And again, they didn't really get the running in. I think Norris only did like 22 laps in the morning, because after the delays, because the drain cover once again came up, they decided, all right, after we've dealt with that situation, we're just going to run the whole day. No lunchtime, so, you know, no hour break for lunch. They just ran the day all the way through to its conclusion, so the teams could do what they want. But again, not probably of all the teams, McLaren probably had not the smoothest weekend by any means. They didn't do the fewest laps. We'll see which team that is here in a second. This, though, is Ferrari. They did also not do the fewest laps this weekend. These were their tyres, though. People love to talk about this, and for good reason, really. The tyre degradation of Ferrari. Last year, we know the SF23 was a nightmare in that category, to be fair, and people were looking at these C3s and saying, okay, do they look better than they would have done last year? And probably the answer to that is yes. The data also indicates that, but I will say this moment's here where George Russell actually overtook Charles Leclerc without using DRS. This was, okay, I wouldn't say a race situation, but it wasn't too dissimilar, because the reason why Russell was overtaking Leclerc was because they were both on long runs, and Russell was way faster than Leclerc on this particular long run. Doesn't mean everything. We're going to have a look at the numbers. Look, fuel load, engine mode, you just don't really know. But it's notable that the only real reason this was happening was because Leclerc was suffering with some pretty bad degradation from this case specifically, but that may just be inherent to one setup that Ferrari were running rather than what they've generally experienced over the weekend, because it's definitely been better. Even James Vowles as well said, because we saw the rumours the other day and actually confirmed, of course, now that Williams is using Mercedes' old suspension design on the rear suspension rather than a new one that Aston Martin have taken instead. And Vowles explains this to say, well, if we took the new one, we would have far less time to develop around it. So it seemed to make more sense to Williams to run last year's Mercedes rear suspension and then start development 4 months earlier. Wind tunnel runs beginning in April, for example, which, you know, may make sense. The Williams was a bit up and down, I've got to say, this weekend. They didn't really put together anything particularly spectacular, but Max Verstappen did, especially in the long runs. These are some of the numbers, though, with Verstappen on the C3 tyre here, put in a 1:31.0. Nobody actually got close today, really, to Sainz's time yesterday in the 1:29s. But Leclerc did set the fastest time of the day with a 1:30.4 in the end. This was on the C4 tyre, I'm pretty sure. I think it came up as the C5, but I think it might have actually been the C4. Not 100% sure of that, to be honest. Nobody really seemed to know. But Verstappen was on the C3, about 3.5 tenths back. They were talking on the comms, though, that this was an older set of medium tyres, the older set of C3s. And if that's true, that Verstappen's fastest lap time was very competitive and far more competitive than anybody else on the C3s, and that was a used set, just, you know, honestly, just chalk it up now, to be honest, based on what we have seen today. But he wasn't the fastest lap time of the day. That did go to Charles Leclerc. Other guys got close, though. Max actually got a little bit closer. I think maybe his first run was a 1:37, and then he did another run on the same set and then still did a 1:37 or 1:30.7, slightly faster. So I'm pretty sure that it is true that on a used set, Verstappen still set a very competitive time, and that's tough to do at Bahrain. The tyre deck is pretty big, and that C3 is the soft tyre next weekend. So that is a compound you wouldn't typically expect to get more than one great lap out of. This is some of the comparison as well last year compared to this year. This is comparing from F-data analysis here, last year's qualifying times compared to this year's results. So Sainz, his time yesterday, was actually faster than last year's Ferrari qualifying time by a smidge. They were down on top speeds. They were down in the fast corners. They were slightly quicker in the slower corners, actually. So clearly shows as well here that the Ferrari hasn't lost that much straight line performance. This is engine mode, pure and simple. So Ferrari, I think, are leaving a lot on the table right now with their engine mode, and there were rumours that they're definitely not going to turn anything up at all until next weekend. So I think Ferrari are more competitive than they are letting on right now, and the Red Bull actually might be more slippery in a straight line this year than last year's car, but they were only slightly down on last year's straight line speed in the head-to-head comparison. But of course, this year's best time for Max was a bit away down on what he qualified with last season. Now, the Mercedes was looking better as the day progressed. Of course, at the end of the day, the track is cooler, better conditions, more rubbered in, so you're expecting the better times to come towards the ends. Russell did, I mean, his laps were kind of all over the place, really. They were trying things with setup clearly Mercedes. They put him out like 3 consecutive one-lap sprints to see what he could do. And every time they sent him back out there, he was either struggling in Sector 1 or Sector 2. Sector 3 was pretty quick overall, but actually Yuki Tsunoda even here put in a very competitive lap with the RB. That seems to be, probably understandably, the team to watch, really. Out of this test, of all the teams that I've seen, I think RB is the team that will concern many in the upper midfield as to potentially be a serious contender, because let's be honest here, their car is rather a lot like last year's Red Bull. Now, Russell did end up improving and nearly went P1. He was only 500ths behind Leclerc's time on the C4 tyre that Russell set this lap time on with a purple final sector. So yeah, the Mercedes looked okay. They definitely got it in a decent window towards the end of the day, and maybe part of that was based on the suspension change that we were about about to discuss. Just to note, though, as well, that Pirelli say the difference between the compounds is substantial. Apparently 6 to 7 tenths of a second between the C3 and the C4. So, and apparently the C1 and C2 are quite close together. So that was kind of the discussion on it. So if you're looking at those qualifying times and you're seeing Max 3 tenths down, apparently the difference in those compounds is like 6, 7 tenths. So there's clearly a margin that Red Bull have to play with. But Mercedes are playing with a lot today. There were also these tufts that were noticed on their floor edges, which could kind of show them what the airflow was doing. But it was spotted early parts of the day that Mercedes were playing around with their front suspension. Not sure I'd exactly call this an upgrade because, it's not like they've brought a new package to the car, but they've tried one concept and suspension setup. They've now tried a quite radically different one, really, in terms of where the wishbones lock in. So it was spotted here that there's this panel which they can clearly detach and then retach wherever they want to put these wishbones into place. Now, look, I'm not an Adrian Newey when it comes to suspension setup and concept. I'm not really going to be able to tell you guys whether this is good or bad. But the theory is that by taking... So you guys look at this wishbone where these arrows are right here. This line that we're looking at here went from slightly more parallel to slightly more at an angle is the way that I would describe it. There's a better image as well. Let's have a look at it from here, actually. So this is Formula Uno points out as well. Pretty much adding in some anti-dive into the suspension. It's a key talking point of Red Bull suspension over the last couple of years. They have lots of anti-dive, lots of anti-squat, which pretty much means that when you brake the car or when you accelerate, the car doesn't rock back and forth as you might expect, let's say, a motorbike to do if you slammed on the brakes, for example. A car does the same thing as that, but if you set up the suspension in a certain way, it does less of that. Now, that carries its downsides, but in Red Bull's case, it carries many upsides as well. Incredibly consistent on the tyres. The platform is super stable over the course of a lap, generating consistent downforce. So this on the right-hand side was day 2, where the wishbone was mounted in. Today, they moved it down quite substantially here on day 3. So Mercedes obviously trying something not radically different, but it's quite substantially different. I don't think we often see stuff like this going on. I don't really think we saw it from any other team during the course of the weekend. So Mercedes still a lot to think about, a lot to work on, right? There has been some talk that their rear suspension has not been causing them headaches precisely, but they've brought a new rear suspension, brought a new push rod rear suspension like Red Bull have. Ferrari is sticking with the pull rod, for example, that they've known from the last couple of years. And the theory goes that now that Mercedes have that push rod suspension in, they've got more to understand, more to learn, and maybe more to tweak on the front suspension to actually make sure the car is compliant as possible. Because I think it seems that the rear is more, manageable this year than last year's car, certainly. But making that balance with the front suspension is something Mercedes are trying to solve, it seems. So they tried a few things. Whether their data indicates that today's setup was better or worse, I guess that remains to be seen. The evidence probably points towards that it was slightly better, but maybe we'll see some announcements from Mercedes or some rumours from Mercedes over the coming days as to what they really thought. There was also talk from Albert here that if you look at the radiators within the side pods on Mercedes, there is still potentially room for slimming those down. That's not even a word. But, to slim the side pods further if they wanted to. Rumours that potentially Red Bull are exploring a similar idea soon. So it is plausible that in a few races' time, now Mercedes seem to have a better foundation, a better platform to build on. They might make some quite serious tweaks to the way their car looks. I wouldn't be surprised either at some point if they bring an engine cover that looks more like what they had last year and similar to what Red Bull have this year. But let's have a look at some of these long-run lap times, right? Because this is when we start to see why Red Bull are considered to be the strongest team. This is by way of comparison, a C3 stint from Nico Hülkenberg. We can see a 1:38.6 dropping off to a 1:39.6 towards the end of the stint. Not a particularly long stint, 10, 12 laps or so on what is effectively the soft tyre for next weekend in probably the slowest car right now. So 1:38, something like that. These were Alonso's times. Actually, much better degradation here, barely any deg at all. Starts with a 1:37.6, finishes with a 1:37.5. So, significantly quicker than Hülkenberg. We don't know, fuel levels, stuff like this. But, it's interesting to note. Those were Alonso's times over quite a few laps, to be fair. These were Russell's times over fewer laps, but still, you can see he's pushing quite hard, right? If you're doing a 1:35 on the soft, it's going to degrade a bit. Towards the end of the stint, he was doing about a second a lap slower, and that was only like 6-7 laps before he came in, but still reasonably quick times, I would say, there from Russell. These, though, were Verstappen's times on the C3. So, considering that Alonso was probably half a second back from this, just look at the consistency that Verstappen's able to get from the soft compound. Let's not forget, this isn't the hard compound. This is the soft compound that for Hülkenberg was going off within, 10 or so laps. So 1:37.4, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 0, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1. if you want to beat Red Bull, you've got to beat Red Bull, and you've got to beat, like, absolute metronomic Max Verstappen, because that's what he is. You can actually see, this is on his C2 run later on his dashboard here. The top right-hand side, it shows you his delta from the previous lap. So I'm sure that he's trying to keep that as close to 0 as possible, because it looks good, right? The closer you are to your previous lap time. So you can see here that halfway around the lap, or nearly at the end of the lap, to be fair, he's only a 10th down on his previous lap. So I'm sure that Max is looking at that quite a lot and maintaining the lap times as much as he possibly can. But I'm not sure there's any other car right now that's capable of doing those type of lap times with that tyre on a consistent basis. This was Leclerc's C3 race run on that same tyre. And there's a lot of dead here. Now, this is quite a lot of laps, but still, starts with a 37.1, where Verstappen finishes lap times. Within 10 or so laps, Leclerc was on a 37 high 38s. Then he was on a 38.1, 38.1, 38.1, 38.4. And this is when Russell made the overtake that we mentioned. So, you know, whether you want to say Ferrari's tyre deg is back, or whether you want to say maybe it was a setup thing, I'm more inclined to believe the latter, because Ferrari's tyre deg did actually look really quite good in Leclerc and Sainz's hands earlier in the weekend. So maybe it was something they're playing with in the setup, which didn't really work to their advantage here, because Verstappen on the C1 did the following, 37.2. I mean, really similar lap times. And you'd expect from the harder compounds, he's going to be able to even generate more performance towards the end of the stint as the fuel load burns off. But you can see here that he only gets faster on this C1 stint. And that's not necessarily the case with the other drivers. This was Alonso, by the way. And just there's a bit more variation here. I think, like, first of all, Verstappen's great. But I think it's also a level of consistency in the car. When you see a guy like Alonso, who's also incredibly good, have variations between 37.4, 37, 8, 37.2, 37.1, bit of variation there, right? Maybe more than you might normally expect. I think that's also down to the car. Like, the Red Bull just seems super drivable that Verstappen barely has to make any corrections, and therefore can always deliver some very consistent lap times. These were Piastri's numbers as well, just to mention, so these are pretty good. I mean, you've got to say, given it wasn't the best weekend for McLaren, or best few days for McLaren theoretically, 37.5, 4, like, these are pretty good times, not too dissimilar to what Max was doing, to be fair, in the Red Bull. There's obviously so much you can take away from this, and some of it might not be good to take away from because we don't know all the details. This was Leclerc's C1 race sim as well. This was actually impressive, I thought. They were down in the low 36s here, and yes, it's the hardest compound, and he didn't do that many laps on it, but there wasn't really much deg in play this time, maybe a little bit towards the end of the stint, but probably nothing you wouldn't expect when you're pushing the tyre there pretty hard. But the big takeaway is the Red Bull are the strongest team, and there were even rumours emerging yesterday that paddock rumours are suggesting that Red Bull's advantage over the winter has actually not closed up, but has actually grown, and the RB20 is even more dominant compared to its competition than the RB19 was last season. If that's true, there will be lots of questions on the cost cap, on these regulations, and all the other factors that have played a part in this, when we were told the set of regulations was going to create the exact opposite situation. And even rumours are saying that Verstappen is reporting to the team that he likes this car better. It reacts better, and he prefers it in many ways. That's not just the speed, but it's also the way that it reacts to his driving style. So if you thought that the Verstappen-Perez gap was bad last year, then get ready, baby, because it's probably going to go stratospheric this time. Even Will Buxton's analysis at the end of the few days of testing was the following: Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Aston, Mercedes, RB. I think it's really tight between these five. Haas are definitely the worst, I would say. He's even got Alpine P8, which is pretty rough for them, but I wouldn't be massively surprised. And the Williams did show some signs of life today. So these were the overall numbers. Final day of testing. Shout out to Sauber as well, doing a bit of a glory run at the end here with Zhou Guanyu. So he actually stuck at P3, got ahead of Max Verstappen on a lap time when it was set much earlier, of course, in the day. But the real winners of testing, as far as I'm concerned, were Haas, because they did the most laps. Congratulations, Haas. 441 laps over the weekend. Hopefully they figured out what's going on with their tyres, because that was apparently the main goal of this test, not to search for performance, and they certainly didn't find any performance, so they got one part of that story, right? Ferrari, though, was second. 416 laps they did. Red Bull at 391. Sauber and Aston Martin tied. Then Red Bull, Mercedes, I said Red Bull, I can't believe it. RB, that's 367. Then Mercedes 361, and Williams just under 300. So to be fair, McLaren wasn't that bad, right? They weren't too far down on some of these other teams in the middle, but yeah, not the cleanest weekends. Generally speaking, though, the reliability was really strong. Not too many difficulties from these cars. And if that continues when the season starts, we can probably expect a rather consistent trend of race victors. So very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.